I'd like to thank you all for joining us here today at our webinar on the prerequisites for creating traded and competitive gas markets in Asia. I'm Monalizia Hazra, Regional Energy Manager and Clean Energy Specialist in the Indo-Pacific office at USAID, India. Today's webinar has been organized by the U.S. Asia Gas Partnership, also known as the AGP, a public-private alliance between the government and industry representatives to optimize the development of secure, reliable, and economic sources of natural gas across the Indo-Pacific. The partnership is designed to both highlight technical topics for regulators, utilities, and policymakers in the region, and to foster business development and networking. Best practice documents, technical standards, safety guidelines, and environmental regulations will be shared with partners in emerging LNG or liquefied natural gas importing countries across the Indo-Pacific. Countries in South and Southeast Asia will show the largest market growth in LNG through 2040 as demand from traditional importers in North Asia and Europe declines. Practical training and strategic advice targeted at ministries and regulators aim to drive more informed policy and decision-making to increase investments across the region. As a part of AGP, USAID's partner, USEA or United States Energy Association, and the National Association of Regulatory Utilities Commissioners will host a series of live and recorded webinars featuring leading US and international gas sector experts. I'd like to thank USEA, ICF, and the South Asia Regional Energy Hub for organizing today's event, which will provide insights on the evolution of gas markets across the region. Our esteemed panelists will discuss best practices and recommendations for the development of market hubs that would enable gas infrastructure development and price signals for the Indo-Pacific region. I'd like to thank you all again for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you virtually at another Asia Gas Partnership webinar. To date, we have had more than 1,700 participants from 69 different countries take part in our knowledge sharing events. If you haven't done so already, please do register for upcoming webinars or listen to pre-recorded presentations from the series at usea.org. In closing, I'd like to offer a sincere thanks to our speakers for carving out time to share their unique perspective with us today. We greatly appreciate your insights and commitments. For the webinar participants, we will be posting some Zoom polling questions, and we would very much appreciate if you could answer them during the panel discussion. We will be sharing the results just before the end of the webinar. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Harry Vidas, VP ICF, to provide his introductory remarks. Harry recently supported the USEA in a study on developing LNG hubs in the Asia region. So over to you, Harry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Gurpreet is going to load up the screen with the slides. And I think they're ready now. So the first page I have is the agenda page, Gurpreet. So what I'd like to do is introduce some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today and provide some background information that I hope will set the stage for today's discussion. The first thing I want to do is talk about how natural gas is used in Asia and what portion of the overall energy mix natural gas supplies, particularly within the 8 countries of interest in today's discussion. I also want to talk a little bit about the potential for natural gas in the future in those 8 countries. Number 2, I want to do some a bit of an academic discussion about competitive markets and what makes a competitive market. And then with regard to natural gas, I want to talk a little bit about that study that we were just discussing about how hubs are formed and what are the attributes of a successful hub. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the current developments in some of the important Asian countries and show you a diagram of a schematic of where we think they are in terms of their development toward competitive markets. And then I have some final key takeaways, which are conclusions that I would draw. And then most importantly, I want to just discuss some questions that I think might come up during today's discussion and give you some kind of preview of where we think they might be going. So Gurpreet, the next slide will be the one on the energy markets. I think the important point of this slide is that right now, natural gas overall in Asia represents about 12% of the market for energy. In 2018, the entire market within all Asia was 240 exajoules, and there was almost a 3% growth rate in 2019 of total energy market, total energy. 12% of that was natural gas, as I was saying, which represents a demand of about 801 billion cubic feet per billion cubic meters per year, of which 489 is produced within the region. So overall, Asia produces 61% of its gas consumption and imports 39%. As you can see by the pie diagram, the largest share of energy consumed is from coal, and number two, oil is the second most important. So the 8 countries we want to talk about today are India, Singapore, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And the next slide gives you some information on energy consumption in those countries. I think the most important thing that you can see from the diagram on the left is that each of the countries, just as Asia overall, relies a lot on coal and oil for its shares of energy. And our thinking is that in the future, what's going to happen in these countries is the overall demand for energy is going to go up. And we believe that there'll be a potential not only to supply incremental needs for energy, but also to potentially gain market share against higher priced oil, and in some circumstances, the natural coal as well. If you look at the individual markets on the map, you can see that India represents the largest market with almost 60 billion cubic meters per year. Unlike some of the other countries where power sector is the primary market, in India, the industrial sector is the major consumer of natural gas. Going around the map in a clockwise formation, direction, you can see Bangladesh is the next country on the map with 34.4 billion cubic meters per year of natural gas consumption. And there, like most countries, you see power and industry are the major consumers. In Thailand, which is the second largest market among the 8 countries, almost 51 billion cubic meters per year, power is the major consumer. The Philippines, among these 8 countries, is the smallest natural gas market and the most recent one to develop any sizable market, with a little more than 4 billion cubic meters per year. Malaysia is fairly large, 42.3 billion cubic meters per year. Power sector represents about half of the market. Indonesia, another large market with almost 44 billion cubic meters per year. Again, industry and power are the bigger markets. And then Singapore is the second smallest market with 12.7 billion cubic meters per year, where again, power is the largest consumer, followed by industrial sector. All of these countries have various things going on in terms of developing additional supplies of natural gas. And I won't go through all the different details, but obviously it involves a lot of LNG projects, and they're looking toward diversifying gas sources as well as increasing the market size. So the next slide is the discussion of competitive markets and hubs. So as we talked about, there are some ways economists look at markets to determine if they're competitive or not. And typically the things they look for are many consumers or buyers of the product and many sellers. They looked for no participant having market power, which is to say the ability to influence price by withholding demand, supply, or not purchasing. Good price discovery is another component of a competitive market. And also, what you like to see is a large market where no particular transaction is going to influence the price up or down as being another hallmark of a competitive market. So when we look at natural gas in competitive markets, what we generally are looking for is a concentration of the market in some kind of geographic location. And what we typically look for is in the hub is either a physical location where there's a lot of interconnectivity, a lot of sources of supply, a lot of different consumers, and also another thing we're looking for typically is some amount of storage of natural gas, which facilitates both the transactions, but it also creates the ability to develop some derivative markets as well. But if we look on the left-hand side here and say, what are the components of a gas hub? Number one, it's interconnectivity. In other words, there's a lot of sources of supply, a lot of potential demands. The other thing we're looking for is non-discriminatory third-party access to pipelines in particular. Typically, a hub will have some kind of hub operator, either a formal market or at least an operator that will be able to transfer gas among the participants within the hub at a relatively minor price. And then the final thing we're looking for typically is strategic location, in the sense that it represents access to a large part of supply and demand within the overall country that it represents. Thank you. The next slide, Gurpreet. I don't want to go through this in great detail, but I think this is the way we were looking at how markets start, how they become competitive, and then how they form a sophisticated competitive market over time. And typically, if you look at any natural gas market that's begun, it usually begins at a relatively small size, sometimes with just one or two suppliers and just a few buyers. It's very often the case that there'll be regulated prices by the government, or if there is not a governmental price, it's a negotiated price between a relatively small number of parties with some kind of pricing formula. And then what happens over time, we hope, is that the market grows, and the steps that it goes through, the different stages are shown here on the diagram. Essentially, what's the most important thing is for there to be if there is a regulation, some deregulation of prices so that there can be a price formation taking place. We're also looking for third-party access to pipeline facilities, storage facilities, and also access to the markets. Initially, it's all done primarily by bilateral trading. There isn't necessarily an exchange or even a posted price through surveys. But as the volume continues, you move away from bilateral trades, which aren't necessarily even known to anybody other than the participants, to a more transparent system where there will be either some kind of price index that's published or even an exchange. And as you move to that, you generally have some kind of standardization of the transactions, usually through some kind of standard contract. And then you have, as I said, more participants, usually through some kind of broker trading, and then some kind of price indexation, which is a more formal way in which the price gets known. And then at some point in the process, you end up with we call it non-physical traders, and we mean both in the sense of speculators that might buy and sell in order as a profit-making exercise, but also in terms of providing liquidity into a futures market. And then that's usually the final stage, is where you have a very robust physical market, a lot of participants, standardized contracts, some kind of index price, and then the evolution of derivatives, which allow you to not only trade in the physical market, but also in the futures market, along with all the other kind of derivative components that there are. So if I look at the next slide, Gurpreet, this is a schematic of where our 8 countries are in terms of the kinds of characteristics that we were just talking about. And then the ones that we put on the slide are related to price controls. Are they still controlled by government action? Is allocation to supply in some way limited? Is third-party access provided? And you can see here that the countries vary in terms of where they are along the continuum toward competitive nature. We really only have Singapore among the 8 countries that has and to some degree, Indonesia is moving there toward as well, a competitive market where the price can be formed by buyers and sellers. Several of the countries still contain some kind of allocation system in terms of who has access to natural gas. They are, however, there is, other than for Bangladesh, a good representation among these 8 countries in terms of third-party access. And you can see here from the notes here that several of the countries are taking steps toward more competitive markets in terms of unbundling of services, and the deregulation and price liberalization. And of course, that's our subject for today's discussion. So if on the next slide, I would say the conclusions that we would draw from this are that if you're looking for competitive markets, probably the 3 most important things we're looking for is unbundling of natural gas transportation from the commodity service, some kind of non-discriminatory third-party access to let more participants into the market, both as buyers and sellers, and then some kind of deregulation of natural gas prices that would allow a market to actually exist as opposed to it being through regulation. If we look around the world and where gas market hubs have developed and where they've been successful, I think it would be fair to say they're entirely based on pipeline models, meaning that they represent either a physical location or a group of locations nearby that can form a virtual market where they're connected through pipelines. And that allows the gas to move around, and you have essentially a single price or almost one price for the same time period and same level of service. But if you look at Asia, we don't really see the pipeline model working because so much of the market is made up of LNG, which is much less easily transferred within a short period of time from buyer to seller and location to location. But there are ways in which the Asian market can develop hubs that are primarily based on LNG with some degree of pipeline transactions as well. And of course, that's the question of how well can that be done and how successful can that be done. The other thing I think we need to think about is that almost in every instance where you've had a competitive market develop, it comes about through some kind of market reform and regulatory reform, which is to say there's somebody within the policymaking community who sees the advantages, the efficiency advantages, and also the potential advantages of making the market larger by carrying out the kind of reforms we're talking about here in terms of unbundling, third-party access, and price deregulation. And then the final point is that we're obviously seeing substantial changes in the LNG market, which I think are helping to try to provide some degree of price discovery in the LNG market, also provide the kind of flexibility that's going to be needed in order to be able to have LNG serve a competitive market and contribute toward it in terms of price flexibility and also delivery flexibility that we're seeing in the market for LNG. So the final slide that we have here is kind of a preview of some of the questions I think that we'll be hearing from Gurpreet. One is just how do people understand what's needed to be done in order to create a competitive markets, where the countries are in terms of along the continuum toward those competitive markets, to what degree is there a commitment toward this, and is there an indication that people, the policymakers, do see the kinds of economic efficiencies that I was talking about in terms of having lower prices, more flexibility, and potentially larger markets. The fourth item we want to talk about is LNG and to what degree the changes in LNG markets are helping to create competitive markets within Asia. And then the final point, to the degree we have time to talk about it, is how do these changes in the markets, which have all been, as we've been talking about them, deal with the regulations of a country's market, and also the pricing and infrastructure access. How do those changes affect LNG suppliers in terms of what services they might offer, what pricing mechanisms they're willing to offer, what kind of contractual terms, and then also how do they see that in terms of their optimism towards the market growth and their willingness to invest in those markets. So I know that was a lot to capture, but I think at least I've introduced some of the main topics that Gurpreet wants to, I think, talk about. So Gurpreet, I'm going to turn it over to you now and let you carry the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harry. Thanks for taking us, Harry, through your thoughts and the study that you did with the USAID on the LNG market development in the Asia Pacific, and talking to us about the drivers of competition that must be in place in markets to attract the right kind of LNG at the right kind of terms and prices. So we now get into the next part of this webinar, where we want to discuss with some of the experts who are here with us. And frankly, there couldn't be a better time for us to talk about the LNG markets. I'm sure, as all of you know, that Asia Pacific has been the largest consumer of LNG for a long time. And it is expected that Asia will continue to remain a large consumer, the largest consumer for LNG for the next foreseeable future as well. There are a number of changes that are happening today in the LNG world. Traditionally, we've all seen the point-to-point, long-term, strict take-or-pay contracts that have driven the LNG industry and the investments in the LNG industry. But now a lot of that is changing. Many new suppliers are available, especially a lot of hub-linked suppliers from the US are looking for markets. So it's an exciting time for Asian markets where there is a lot of LNG chasing these markets. And at that time, it brings a situation where the LNG markets can look to create a competitive market in these countries and therefore attract the LNG that we have. So with that, I will move into the panel discussion. And I'm very happy to share that we have a glittering panel of experts with us today. I'm just going to briefly introduce them before I talk to them and ask them their views about the market development. So if we can move to the next slide, our first panelist is Mr. Rajiv Mathur from India, who's Executive Director, Corporate Affairs in GAIL. He has more than 30 years of experience in the gas industry and has been working in GAIL in different profiles in marketing, business development, trading, and transmission as well. He also was the managing director for the city gas distribution entity of Mumbai and coordinated the inputs towards preparation of the master plan for MOPNG. We are delighted to have you with us, Mr. Mathur, today. Our next
Thank you.
Welcome. Our next panelist, if you go to the next slide, is Mr. Leonardo Pulido, who also like us to address him as Bodhi Pulido. He's Assistant Secretary, Department of Energy, Philippines. He's a lawyer by profession, a social entrepreneur, and also a pioneer in electric vehicle industry in Philippines. Truly a multifaceted individual. Right now, he is the Assistant Secretary for Philippines Department of Energy and supervising the Oil Industry Management Bureau, the Energy Resource Development Bureau, and the field offices in Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. Welcome, Mr. Pulido. We are delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Pleasure. If you move to the next panelist, we have with us Mr. Rohan Seneviratne, who a lot of you may have already heard in the recent webinars. He's Assistant General Manager, Ceylon Electricity Board, Sri Lanka. He has 30 years plus of experience in the field of engineering and technology. Mr. Seneviratne joined Ceylon Electricity Board, which is a national power utility in Sri Lanka, in 1986 as an electrical engineer, and has served in many divisions of the organization in different capacities. And currently he serves as additional general manager. He also functions as the project committee chairman for the project on deployment of LNG for power generation in Sri Lanka. Welcome, Mr. Seneviratne. We look forward to hearing your views.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Next, we have Mr. Eric Ebelin, who's a senior VP Business Development in Total. He's been working in the gas industry for a long time, since 1985, initially with Gaz de France, then with NG, and now with Total. He has spent his career in many different international locations doing business development and project development. And he has been located in India as well as a nominee director on the board of Petronet LNG Limited. So welcome, Eric. We look forward to having you with us and hearing your views about supplying LNG to the Asian LNG markets. Thank you for sharing the presentation. I think we can now move back to the video view, and would love to have all panelists switch on their video. Our audience is keenly looking forward to hearing from you. So let me begin with a question to you, Mr. Mathur, and perhaps love to hear your views about the Indian gas market and how it is evolving. A number of reforms and steps, as you know, are being taken in the Indian market today. A gas exchange has been set up. A number of CGD hubs have been given out for licensing. The government has a target to increase the share of natural gas to 15%. What do you think the Indian natural gas market will evolve? What are the important steps for enabling a competitive and thriving market in India?
Thank you very much, Mr. Gurpreet Chok, for giving me an opportunity, and thank you, ICF and the U.S. India Gas Task Forum for giving me an opportunity to share my views. As we all know, India is a growing market, and as the GDP grows, as the economy grows, the use of energy also is about to grow in a compounded manner, of which natural gas finds a very prominent place in the policy initiatives taken by the Government of India. And the government's stated objective is to increase the share of gas from 6% to 15% in the energy basket. Now, 6% to 15% is actually quite a tall order, but enable us to catapult the use of gas across various segments in India. Government has taken up various policy reforms, and some of the reforms include setting up of an exchange where you could freely trade gas. They have allowed pricing and marketing freedom to anybody who produces gas in the country. Then they have allowed third-party access of infrastructure, pipeline, terminals, etc. Then they have come out with a position paper on creation of a transmission service operator, TSO, who will set up the rules of the game where people could be easily able to access the infrastructure. Also, the Government of India has committed billions of dollars in creating of infrastructure. So while the India as a country is a huge geographical area, only the western, central, and parts of northern India were really connected through a pipeline network. And what the government has now done is, through various bidding mechanisms that they have put in place, they have put in a regulator through whom anybody can apply to, create an infrastructure. And there is a competitive, transparent bidding mechanism through which you bid for the tariff and you get the pipeline authorization. So all that the government has been doing in the past, which has allowed a lot of new pipelines to come up in various other parts of the country. And in areas where the economic value, perceived economic value for creation of infrastructure was not very high, the government has come forth with something called a viability gap funding. And so in the eastern and northeastern part of India, they have allowed 40 to 60% VGF in the capex of the infrastructure which is getting created there. And that allows, the laying of infrastructure and creation of infrastructure, to be viable for any entity who chooses to construct the infrastructure. So with all that happening, new markets are opening up in India. Till yesterday, we had maybe 1/3 or 1/4 of the Indian geographical area covered through pipeline networks. As we go along in the next 3, 4, 5 years progressively, you will see almost the entire country interconnected with a network of pipelines or transmission pipelines, and they shall be connected with the domestic supply sources as well as imported gas which would flow through the land-based LNG terminals as well as the FSRUs which are getting created. So government on its part has been trying to create, first of all, open up the market space and allow the customers to access natural gas. At the same time, they are allowing competition between domestic gas, which is getting produced, and imported LNG, which is available today at very competitive prices. So, and then at the end of it all, they are allowing all the producers who are there to, freely market the gas. They are also allowing them to discover the price, whether that can be through a direct, negotiation and then or through a portal. One exchange has also got set up recently, which has got authorization also. So one could actually offer the gas on the exchange for people to buy and then discover the price. So all in all, it augurs very well for India to catapult from a 6% share for gas to 15%, especially through the various mechanisms which are intensifying or trying to encourage the domestic producers to discover the price themselves, to market the gas themselves instead of the allocation methodology that was there in the past. And also it tries to open up and create a level playing field for third-party operators, for anybody who has gas to access the infrastructure and to actually sell their volume to a customer. And at the same time, it allows a customer a choice to, get the gas or the commodity from the existing supplier or anybody else who is willing to offer the volumes on the platform or through a direct, contract between the parties. And in addition to that, so this was about the creation of the national infrastructure for free flow of gas. In addition, what the government has done is, through the regulator, allowed 10 rounds of bidding for creation of CGD networks. Now, the city gas distribution networks are actually geographical area networks. So it not only is getting a network created within the city for the last mile to reach the end customer, to reach the every kitchen, it is also creating an infrastructure for the small and medium industries, for the commercial establishments, for the transport sector to open up in a big way to use gas within the cities. So it's opening up a market for use of CNG in a very big way. It's also opening up another opportunity for on the highways and expressways where direct dispensing of LNG would be possible. And a couple of stations are already getting set up. By the end of this year, or beginning of next year, we shall have about 50 LNG stations also up and operating. And today we already have about 2,500 to 3,000 CNG stations in place. Those stations, the number will go up to about 12,000 in the next 5 to 6 years. So with that kind of distribution network also opening up, it augurs well for gas to command a much higher share in the energy mix of the country, and for newer players to access the market and to freely trade should they wish to invest in the Indian market. I think
Right.
I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take
Sure.
questions.
No, I think thank you so much, Mr. Mathur, for giving us a very wide background about what all activities are happening in Indian gas market and the developments around infrastructure, both for pipeline, CGD, and LNG. And it certainly is a very valuable background for the audience to understand that infrastructure and access is quite important to creating traded markets. With that, let me actually now go to Mr. Bodhi Pulido to talk about Philippines, another gas market, which, and from where we have representation today. Mr. Pulido, we understand that Philippines is looking towards LNG as a fuel to replace, the eventual fall in the production from the Malampaya field and support power generation primarily. My, question, or, I'd love to hear your views about what are the other sectors, and is Philippines also looking for gas to, for example, fuel industries, transport sectors? And we acknowledge that Philippines has many islands. So what's the current thinking, and what is the future of gas and LNG in Philippines, given the various infrastructure issues that will come because of the islands that exist? And are you also therefore looking to go beyond just the electricity sector and incorporate gas as a fuel in other sectors? So request your thoughts and views, Mr. Pulido.
Well, definitely. Currently, the use of natural gas in the Philippines is, of course, limited to power generation, considering that we only have a single indigenous resource. And, well, as you said earlier, Malampaya's supply is slowly declining. And there were actually early efforts to use natural gas in transportation. However, it did not pan out due to infrastructure and regulatory issues. So we do have a renewed effort to use natural gas for other industries and for the use of natural gas in the transport sector. So we are currently working with our Philippine Senate, with the office of the chairman of the Committee on Energy, Senator Gatchalian. We have recently introduced a bill for the mid to downstream natural gas industry. And in that bill, we did introduce quite a few fiscal and non-fiscal incentives for non-power industries to encourage them to switch fuel sources, say from coal, which is what is predominantly used in a lot of manufacturing and cement plants in the Philippines, or say diesel, to natural gas. And we're hoping that bill, once it's passed into law, would also create an environment wherein we would be able to create infrastructure and a better regulatory environment for the use of natural gas in public transportation, such as, say, compressed natural gas for Philippine buses. And although we do want to expand the use of natural gas, not only in power, but also to other industries, for the immediate future, we believe natural gas would primarily be for power generation. And one of the significant developments that have occurred recently is the fact that the DOE issued a circular that essentially puts a temporary moratorium on coal for power generation. And considering that we will be needing an additional power capacity of around 43,000 megawatts by 2040, the first utility, the nature of the technology of natural gas in power generation, it can fill in the supply requirement across the grid, either for base load, mid-merit, or for the peaking demand. We also believe that as we move towards the future, we do want to use more renewable energy, and we want to use LNG to provide that ancillary capacity to support the intermittent nature of renewable energy. And as you discussed earlier in your question, with the geography of the Philippines as an archipelago, we have a lot of islands scattered throughout the country that rely on small diesel fire generators. And we have heard of the use of small ISO tanks of LNG that have been used in various islands in the Caribbean, for example. And although we haven't seen it, and we were actually planning a trip to the Caribbean last March, but of course, what happened recently with the pandemic, we wanted to look at the use of these small LNG plants for our off-grid or missionary islands, hopefully to replace existing diesel-fired plants. which is quite significant. We believe that that will be about a capacity of at least 500 megawatts. So that's how we see LNG for the future. We are hoping that we would have a strong regional market in the region. We are lucky to be situated in an area where some of the biggest LNG suppliers and buyers are located. Australia, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea supply about, I think, 35% of total world LNG exports last year. And 3 countries in Asia, Japan, China, and South Korea, account for about 50% of the total world LNG imports. So the fact that we're well within this neighborhood, we can draw LNG supplies from these countries where we believe there could potentially be an excess capacity or a projected excess capacity in the future. And the proximity, of course, would result to more cost-effective transport. But we're also hoping and praying that the strong regional market here can result to certain changes in the, let's say the international LNG market dynamics. And I'm referring to the fact that despite changes or significant changes in the global marketplace, the prices of natural gas in Asia have remained linked to crude oil. And we believe that it doesn't really reflect regional supply demand fundamentals. And so we're hoping that being part of a stronger regional market would be able to change that. So thank you for your questions.
Thank you. I think that's a great response, and covering all aspects of how you look at not only the developments in regulation and infrastructure, but also regionally being in a location where there is so much LNG traffic, literally, ships passing by, that places you in a position where you can benefit from a regional market. With that, let me come to Mr. Rohan Seneviratne, and Sri Lanka is perhaps knocking on the doors of LNG or natural gas, not yet a natural gas market, but looking to be a natural gas market. So, would love to hear your views and thoughts about what are the current developments in Sri Lanka towards setting up of LNG import terminals. And if you can shed some light on these plans and the developments, and when do you expect Sri Lanka to become another new LNG consumer in this ever increasing space of LNG consuming countries?
Okay, thank you for inviting me for this webinar. As you very correctly pointed out, our energy balance doesn't have natural gas at this moment of time. Our energy balance mainly consists of liquid petroleum, that is about 43%, and the biomass is about 45%, and electricity is about 12%, and so on. So natural gas is not in our energy equation, but we are hoping to bring natural gas initially to the power generation, and then to expand to other possible areas in the country. So the biggest market that we can create from natural gas is from the power generation. So in addition to that, we can think about other markets like industries and commercial establishments and vehicles and households and so on. But when you really look at those areas, we do not have infrastructure to deliver natural gas to the doorsteps of houses or commercial establishments, industries, and so on. So developing of that last mile network for natural gas is a huge challenge for the moment, because we are yet to start looking at the construction of infrastructure to deliver natural gas for those sectors. But as far as power sector is concerned, it's more feasible, and it demands more on the consumption when you look at the natural gas. Because for the moment, if you really look at our electrical energy mix, we do produce electrical energy from fuel petroleum, that is diesel and furnace oil, about 35%. So that's a huge, large amount, and that has caused a lot of problems of financial issues and the high cost of power generation and the environmental pollution and so on. So therefore, what we intend is to replace this oil power generation from renewables and the natural gas. So what government envisage is to have 70% of electrical energy generation by the year 2030 from clean energy sources. So in the clean energy sources, we do have 50% of renewable energy. Those are wind, solar, and hydro, mini hydro, and so on. And the balance 20% we are now earmarking to take it from the natural gas. But we do not have natural gas here. Therefore, what we intend is to bring liquid natural gas and to regasify and into give it to our power plants. So in that context, we are concentrating on the power plants which are located in and around Colombo, so that it will not be a very big distribution network that we have to construct. So initially, our plan is to convert existing power plants to natural gas, and also we have earmarked to construct few more combined cycle power plants, and also those will also be dual fuel power plants, so that we can run those power plants also with natural gas. So our intention is by 2030 to have about 2,300 megawatt of power plants run on natural gas. So in order to bring natural gas, now for the last 1.5 years, we have been working very hard to bring LNG to Sri Lanka and to convert and to regasify and put it to the power plant. So actually, I'm heading that committee, committee of deployment of LNG for power generation. And we have done a lot of work. We have done the pre-feasibilities, feasibilities, and then we have developed the tender documents to procure LNG and to have the terminal and the mooring systems and to have the pipelines as well. So we have come to the last stage now, and most probably we are going to go for competitive tenders to bring the terminal. The terminal will be a FSRU, and it is mainly for as a stopgap arrangement for 10 years period, and the pipeline system will be again another similar investment. And we are looking for investors. Actually, all these two projects that we are talking about, that is the FSRU and the mooring system and the pipeline system, and both are in the BOT concept. So BOO concept. They have to build, operate, and own these things, and especially the pipeline network only we have to transfer. That is build, operate, and transfer. But the FSRU is build, operate, and own. But the mooring system, you have to build, operate, own, and transfer. So those are the models. So we are looking for investors to come and invest on the FSRU and the mooring system, that it will be a one particular tender, and also the other one will be the pipeline network. So both will be investments on BOT and BO model. So we have come to the final stage of tender finalization, and most probably within next 1 to 1.5 months time, we are planning to float the tenders so that it will be competitive tenders, and the investors can come and bid and bring and take part in these two tenders. And the procurement of LNG is also, we want to go for competitive tenders, and to buy for short term as well as short term contracts, and also on the spot market, because when we analyze the markets, what is the long term contracts are now not feasible. The oil indexing long term 20-year contracts and so on. So what we can get the best for the country is from the short term contracts and from the spot market. So and our requirement will be approximately 1 MTPA. That also will vary depending on the weather conditions. And if there is a very wet year, our consumption on LNG will be less. So it varies, so that we want to have a short-term contracts and the spot market, so that we can meet our demand through those two contracts. So all contracts will be on competition, and the transparency will be there, so that the investors can come and bring bid for these tenders and get them selected and provide these services. Because LNG, bringing LNG to the sector will save a huge amount of money for the power generation, and approximately you can save about $200 million per year by bringing LNG to the sector. So our intention is to bring the LNG to the sector by early 2024, and to run about 1,300 megawatts of power plant through the natural gas. So we intend to bring by end of 2023 or early 2024. So this is a very important project for us. And we are working very hard to bring LNG to our energy equation. And once we do that, I think we can think about the other sectors as well, because there are provisions in our designs to go for other sectors, such as if there are potential for commercial and the industrial sectors. Definitely there are close by industrial zones in Colombo, so we can connect them with the natural gas. And also later on, we can look at whether there are any other customers for natural gas and perhaps for households and other things also. But a lot of infrastructure is required. We don't have compressed natural gas or stations and things like that. So those are real challenges of bringing infrastructure. But first we go for power generation, and then we look at the other sectors and to bring all the other sectors, possible sectors, to the natural gas. So that is our plan for the future.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Senivaratne, for sharing, your plans and the activities that Sri Lanka is doing. Looks like, in the next few years, 2-3 years, Sri Lanka would certainly have an import terminal and be one of the LNG consuming nations. So good to hear about the project plan and the timelines. With that, let me come to you, Eric. And there's a reason I wanted to come to you last of all, because I wanted you, as an LNG supplier, to listen to different buyers who we have here. We have, of course, Mr. Mathur, who talked about the Indian market. We had Bodhi Pulido, who talked about the Philippines market, and Mrs. Senivaratne talking about the Sri Lankan market. Of course, there are many more markets in Asia. We had, today we have participation from 3, but there are many other markets existing and emerging. We have Bangladesh emerging as a large LNG import market, Pakistan emerging as an LNG import market. Singapore is another market which is well developed and already has terminals. So there are many other markets that you're seeing across Asia Pacific. So as a supplier, Eric, let me ask you a question. When you look at these markets as a supplier, what do you look for in a market? Do you consider competitive markets in any way better than a controlled market? And if you do consider that supplying to competitive markets is better, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Why do you think about these markets, and how does a competitive market help LNG suppliers as well, bringing more competitive LNG and cost-effective LNG here?
Thank you very much, Gulpreet, and thank you for inviting me to be here today. Before starting responding to your questions, and the transitions to what Juan just said, it is good to hear that Sri Lankan authorities have defined natural gas as clean energy sources. You know that among the gas industry, we are always being part of the fossil fuel family. We are never quite sure if we are part of the problem or part of the solution of the energy transitions. So it's good to hear that Sri Lanka has made the right choice regarding our classifications. So coming back to your questions, first of all, what I would like to say is that it has to be recognized that the market forces in place are always multiple and diverse, and that an LNG supplier is only one of them. Having said that, I would say that what an LNG supplier is primarily looking for today is growth. And this is particularly true for a company like Total, which is the second largest LNG supplier in the world, who is developing several multiple liquefaction projects around the world, in US and Mozambique or in Russia. And before developing this, I think it's good to keep in mind and remind that one of the specificity of natural gas, which differentiates natural gas from most of the other sources of supply, is that natural gas has no captive market, neither as a power fuel, nor as a raw material, nor as a mobility fuel. And accordingly, in order to expand its market share, natural gas has to be competitive within the energy mix of the regions where it is delivered. That's a very important aspect, and which gives a first response to your question a little bit. I also think that today, natural gas, and particularly LNG, has developed intrinsic advantage. The recent evolution of the market, in particular the fast-paced commoditizations reflected by the growing share of spot and short-term cargoes, which represent today more than 1/3 of the total trade of LNG, and which result from multiple factors like the increased flexibility of the contractual clauses like destination clause and the introduction of innovative up pricing indexations are the testimony of these evolutions, which is basically driven by a short-term glut of both the LNG market and the LNG carrier fleet. And this gives LNG penetration force never reached in the past. And this, of course, as mentioned by Rohan, is reinforced by the natural gas environmental advantage. We used to say in Total that natural gas is the best friend of renewable because it resolves the question of intermittence with less CO2 emissions than the other fossil fuels, and not only for power productions, but also mobility, as mentioned by Rajiv in India, where you have developed recently a huge network of CNG and now of LNG retailing stations. So for me, it's very clear that all these intrinsic advantage of natural gas will only achieve their full potential in a competitive, transparent, and deregulated energy market. So that's why I think as an energy supplier, I'm calling for this deregulation and development of UPS or UPS mechanism.
Thank you, Eric, for your valuable comments. And I think, you're right. I think a lot of the countries in the region are realizing the importance of having competitive markets. And the kind of initiatives that we are seeing across Asia is that country after country is looking to deregulate the market, provide open access, have more competition, have more suppliers and buyers interact, set up, exchanges where gas can be traded in a liquid manner. So I think it started on that path. The question always remains, how fast can this be implemented? Can it be done fast enough that gas can actually realize that potential that it has? Because the window is, I guess, a limited window until the next time that these countries take a full decarbonization target and potential look for complete decarbonization. Unfortunately, I have another set of questions, and I'd love to carry on and keep talking to everyone and ask everyone's views, because I think we're just getting warmed up, we're just getting started, and perhaps not even scratch the surface of what we could have discussed today. I do hope that we are able to organize follow-up sessions and talk in more depth about each of these markets and how do we support creation of competitive markets. But unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'll have to maybe stop here and pass it on to Sarah. But before I do, I would like to request all of you to look at the poll that was done. And some very interesting results have come. And the first question itself, when I see, where we asked, in your view, what could be the main driver to increase the share of natural gas consumption in India? The opinion is divided, but it's divided in two areas which are most important. One, policies that support cleaner fuel, like you talked about, Eric, and like Mr. Seneviratne, you mentioned that Sri Lanka having the policy to support gas. And second, having the access to affordable LNG. I think the second one is we are in a market where it is possibility to look at affordable LNG that supplies that are viable. So if we can develop policies in these countries that support cleaner gas, I think the share of natural gas can certainly rise even further. With that, I want to thank all the panelists for their time. And I want to hand it over to Sarah to do a thank you, formal thank you, and close the session. We are a couple of minutes over, Sarah, so apologies for that. But like I said, it's never enough with these conversations. And I know Mr. Rajiv Mathur is also smiling. He has a lot of things to say, I know. And thank you for holding it back because we are limited by time.
Thank you, Gurpreet. Yes, I agree. The conversation was really warming up, and there's never enough time. We could better to do a webinar for 4 hours, but then that cuts into everyone's time, unfortunately. So I want to start by thanking the panelists. This really was a global effort, which is one of the beautiful things about these webinars. And thank you, Eric and Rajiv and Bodhi and Rohan for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it. I want to particularly thank ICF. This was a joint effort between USEA through the U.S. Asia Gas Partnership and ICF. And it was the first time we've partnered like this. And it was a wonderful opportunity. We really, really benefited from their expertise in this subject area. So thank you very much to your team for that. And thank you to Manali Zia Hazra from USAID for joining us today on behalf of USAID and the India mission, and Kristen Madler, who is joining us from Washington, D.C., and also to our friends at the South Asia Regional Energy Hub for their efforts in getting the word out on this important webinar. We had over 300 registrants. Roughly 75 to 90 were joining us live. We'll be sharing a copy of the video so that you can replay it at your leisure, and we'll also share the poll results if you didn't get a chance to look at those. So thank you, everyone. I wish you either a good day or a good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And we encourage you to look at the USEA website for future Asia Gas Partnership webinars such as this one. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Bye.
Bye-bye.